My guest today is Professor Stephen Finlay, who is director of the Dianoia Institute of Philosophy at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, Australia, as well as professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California. He works primarily in metaethics, especially on the meaning and use of normative and evaluative language. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Gil. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this from the other side of the world, so to speak, from Australia. The conversation today is about your book, Confusion of Tongues, A Theory of Normative Language. And as I mentioned, Steve, I have no background in philosophy, so this is obviously a very interesting thing for me to discuss with you and to learn from you. When I hear normative, from economics, we have a meaning for normative, which is sort of prescriptive judgments toward economic development, investment projects, and so on, as opposed to positive economics, which relies on objective data analysis. So when you say normative language, is the definition different or is it about the same?
Starting off with a difficult question. So I recently published a paper on the definition of normativity, in which I distinguished something like 23 different possible senses of the word normative. So I'd say there's a lot of different normative. The word normative, I think, means a lot of different things to different people, although they're all connected a bit. So I think the most important distinction is, for some people in some discourses, the word normative is a bit pejorative.
Yeah.
So the idea is you said prescriptive, that there are social norms of some kind that put pressure on people to act in a certain way. Right. In my corner of philosophy, the word is usually used in a much less pejorative meaning, basically to signify having the force of an ought or a should. And so that only gets us so far, because ought and should can also be sort of externally prescriptive and sort of negative, have a negative aspect. But then there's the internal use of them, where you ask yourself, what should I do? And that's more what philosophers usually mean when they talk about normativity. It's the force of what's good, what I ought to do, what I should do from my own point of view, rather than just what society expects from me or what the system of norms demands of me.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. So in economics, at least from my perspective, I use, I think, one of those 23 definitions that you may have talked about in the paper. When I think about normative, I'm thinking about people saying, this is what you should do, but they don't really have a very objective data analysis. So this is, essentially a judgment, prescriptive may not be the right term, but essentially a judgment that's not really backed up by any sort of data and analysis. So that's how I think about normative versus positive. But in philosophy, as you say, and that is a very helpful definition, you're saying when you say normative, you're basically asking what should I do?
Yes, well, so it's much broader than that, but I think that's a helpful way to focus on what's the contrast or the difference with the more pejorative sense of normative, which is familiar to a lot of people outside of philosophy. Right. So there's sort of the external, one terminology which might be helpful is to distinguish external norms from external normativity from internal normativity. And external normativity we are often alienated from. It often seems like a hostile force which is trying to push us to do things that we don't want to do. Right. But internal normativity that's really from the agent's point of view, not what other people or society or some system of rules tells you ought to do, but what you tell yourself that you ought to do.
Right.
And I guess the expansion of that is, well, what are you doing when you tell other people what they ought to do?
Okay.
And I think maybe a really helpful distinction to get on the table is there are two main ways of thinking about this in philosophy.
Yeah.
So one is, which I think is probably more natural to people from scientific backgrounds, is that the force of the should or the good is really just expressive. It's just, there are things we like, things we want, things we prefer, and we use this language just to express our wants and our preferences. And so that view goes under the label expressivism, that normative language is really just expressing how you feel or what you want or something like that. And then the rival view is that when we use words like should and good, we're actually pointing to some kinds of facts. That there's a fact of the matter, and we might be wrong about it, but it's a fact which, if it exists, then it justifies us acting in this way. And so one of the most fundamental disputes in my corner of philosophy is whether there are these kinds of facts about what's good, facts about what you should do, or whether it's really just a matter of expressing our feelings or preferences.
Yeah, that's also very helpful. So when you say facts, from a philosophical perspective, obviously I don't know anything about this. Do you mean the facts could be different for different people? In a scientific arena, it actually is true that different people have different facts, but we pretend we have a unified set of facts, but it doesn't really exist. Is that the case in philosophy as well?
Yes, no. So I was assuming a different understanding of facts here. So from a philosophical point of view, or at least my philosophical point of view, I would say when I'm talking about facts, I'm talking about the way things are in the world, independent of anybody's beliefs or opinions about them. And so when you talk about different people having different facts, my translation of this is different people have different opinions about what the facts are, but they can't all be right. So, 2 + 2 = 4, that's a fact. And if you disagree, then you're just wrong. That's what's packed into my use of the word fact.
Yeah, the issue there obviously is when you have uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty, different people could focus on different aspects.
Yes.
And could reach different conclusions, which all of them could hold as a fact. But you can reject that because it is potentially a fact, but it is not the only fact in many.
Right. So beyond the very simple dichotomy that I sketched between facts and opinions, and actually I think American school curriculum has a lot to answer for here, because I've seen it in my own children's schoolwork. They teach what, from my point of view, is a completely messed up definition of facts and opinions, where basically the idea is that something is a fact if it's generally accepted. So the very idea of truth is disappearing from high school education. But beyond that simple dichotomy, things do start to get very complicated when you have matters which are perspectival or relative. So one very simple example is, take the sentence, "I am in Melbourne." Is that true or false? Is that a fact? Well, in a very fuzzy sense, we might say it's true for me but false for you.
Right.
But what most philosophers would want to say about that is that that appearance of relativity is actually superficial, because when we understand the sentence, we understand that different things can be said using that sentence. So if I utter the sentence, then what I'm saying is that I, Stephen Finlay, am in Melbourne, and that is true, and it's a fact, and you can't have a different fact about that. But if you use
Right.
that same sentence, then you would say something false, because you would be saying that you, Gil, are in Melbourne, which is not the case either for you or for me.
Right.
So there are, on this way of thinking, there are ways of making sense of talk about truth and facts being relative. But you hold on to this notion of there being an object of truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the book is about language. And you say it's about the meaning and use of normative language.
Yes.
And I want to get some more definitions out so that I and the audience can have a better appreciation for it. So you say I take a linguistic approach, arguing that the evidence from various ordinary uses of uses consistently points toward a unifying semantics for normative words as end-relational.
Yes.
Now, the concept normative. So what's the definition for semantics in your view, and what is end-relational?
Yes. Okay. So that was a mouthful. So let me try to translate that into more easily understood language.
Yeah.
So when I say normative language, I mean particularly words like ought, should, good, bad, a reason to do something. Those are the central examples I discuss in the book.
Yeah.
Now, when I say I give a semantics of those words, I mean that's really just fancy talk for saying I give an account of what they mean, what we are doing, and what we have in mind when we use them. And when I say that I give an end relational theory of that meaning, what I mean is that I interpret these words in terms of claims about relations or connections to possible outcomes or ways the world could turn out to be. So that's abstract. It might be helpful to give sort of a concrete example as well.
Sure.
So if I say, for example, a very mundane sentence, you should take an umbrella today. So what's the meaning of the should there? On my analysis, a word like should is always used in relation to some end or possible state of affairs, outcome in the world. And for this sentence, I think the most natural interpretation is the outcome is keeping dry. So there's a possible description of the future, which is I stay dry today, or you stay dry today. And then the meaning of should in my analysis is that outcome is most likely if you do this thing. So on my treatment, saying you should take an umbrella today means essentially if you're going to stay dry today, then you take an umbrella.
Yeah, yeah. And so if I understand this correctly, Steve, semantics is sort of a structure that is much more defined, whereas normative or kind of giving it context and relationship takes it to the next level. So can I think of semantics sort of the foundational information?
Yes, so I mean, there's actually a lot of dispute about what exactly semantics is, but what I understand semantics to be is the rules, the conventional rules for using words, which we all understand as language users, and which are connected with the words themselves. So the idea is someone uses this word. If you're a competent user of the language, then you immediately associate it with a whole lot of rules for when it fits and when it doesn't fit. And the contrast there is with pragmatics. And pragmatics is another source of interpretive information about what someone might mean, but it's not tied to the specific meaning of the word itself. It's tied to the context or environment in which someone uses the word. So, yeah.
So in some sense, when you think about a computer language, it's almost purely semantics.
That's right.
There is no scope for context. There is no scope for, the words meaning something different in different situations and different relations. So that is almost like pure semantics. Now, in English, we also have pure semantics, but just using semantics, we can't really communicate, right? Otherwise, it'll be very confusing, I would imagine.
Yes. So, no, I think that's a great analogy. I think you're absolutely right that computers are completely tone deaf to context and nuance. And so you have to, everything has to be specified literally and precisely. That's correct. So, for example, computers don't get irony or sarcasm, right? You can't give a computer the instruction, please talk even faster, and hope that it will understand that you're being sarcastic. Well, and I should say, of course, people in AI might complain here and say, well, of course we can program. No, yes, you can definitely program a computer to be sensitive to these things, but then you have to give it explicit instruction. Pragmatics, I mean, in one chapter of the book, I actually offer a theory of pragmatics, which explains it as basically what we are able to read between the lines of what somebody says, based on the assumption that the other person is using their words in the way that they think will be best for achieving whatever their goals or aims for the conversation are.
Yeah, when I was reading some of the abstracts, Steve, I was thinking that, and I don't know if you have any insights into this, when languages started, do you think they would have started with more pure semantics and less context? And as we progressed, we got more and more complex context around semantic language, or it's the other way around. What is your thought?
That question is probably above my pay grade. We might need to ask a linguist about that. I mean, I suspect that semantics and pragmatics both arise together. The very rudimentary language would have very, very simple semantics. But as very sophisticated social creatures, I would think the structures of pragmatic interpretation of other beings seems to me is more fundamental and probably pre-linguistic. So there are also pragmatics of behavior, right? And in a sense, the pragmatics of language is just an extension of interpreting other people's behavior on the understanding that the other creature has desires and preferences and is acting to try to achieve them. So linguistic pragmatics, I think, is just an application of that more general interpretive principle to language. So, okay, I guess I have come around to the answer that pragmatics comes first.
Pragmatics. That makes sense to me. So we can answer this question. We have to probably ask some experts, but it is also possible, I think, as languages evolve, at some point it could turn out to be all pragmatics, purely from a utilitarian perspective. You know, higher levels of pragmatics is actually less costly. So if communication is the only objective, then you behave in some way. But we can maybe contrast that with perhaps academic environments. Do you see in academic environments you have less pragmatics compared to, more of a typical conversational situation?
Yes, I think that would be right. Yeah, sorry, just thinking about this for a moment. I'm pretty confident that that's right, that ordinary conversation has a much more robust pragmatics than academic conversation. But, they are both very rich with pragmatics all the same, I think. I'm also thinking about the thing you started off by saying about the possibility that as language goes on, it might become almost all pragmatics. One thing is, I think that you can't do without semantics altogether, because another way of putting it is that semantics is about signs, so conventional signs for things, whereas pragmatics, I think, is not conventional. It's a meaning and inference. But I think without conventional signs, you simply wouldn't have language. So we need some conventions in order to communicate.
Yeah. I was thinking in conversation, Steve, if you think about jargon and slang, these types of things are actually in some sense moving away from semantics to almost all pragmatics, right? So if the objective is to just convert something, and you don't really care about existing semantics, you sort of invent a new semantics.
Yes,
I don't know.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah.
So sometimes, our use of language can become very plastic and flexible. And we can use words in all kinds of different ways, given a rich enough sort of understanding of our audience. If we're all on the same page and have the same backgrounds and understand each other and our motivations, then then you don't need a whole lot of semantic detail or complexity to be able to communicate a lot of information. I think that's right.
So you say in the book, in the first chapter, you say, I demonstrate that the end relational theory accommodates and explains these features. Features to talk about practicality and objectivity. Featured systematically by appeal to basic principles of conversational pragmatics. So going back to, how do you what is end relational theory?
So that's the idea that what words like ought and should and good mean is they're about relations that things stand in to outcomes or possible future states of the world. And I think actually this talk about relations is a little bit vague. So to make it a little bit more concrete, more specifically, I think it has to do with probability, statistical relations. So go back to my toy example, you should take an umbrella today. The idea is that taking an umbrella has a probabilistic relationship with staying dry. The background being that it's likely to rain today. Given that it's likely to rain today, if you don't take an umbrella, then you're probably going to get wet. If you do take an umbrella, then the probability is higher that you won't get wet. So the idea is that the ultimate analysis of what you are communicating if you use that sentence is something about the probabilities conditional on you acting this way.
Right. So the expectations of that probability for both parties have to be roughly the same for that to work. For example, if I go to a place where it doesn't rain at all, and I say that, then it could be very confusing, right? So isn't there a kind of inherent assumption that both parties know, sort of the general, or both parties have a general expectations?
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. And so I describe my semantics as contextualist, which means that what might look like a very simple sentence is dependent on a background assumption of a whole lot of other information which you don't make explicit. But you really do rely on your conversational partner sharing that information in order to be able to understand and appreciate the truth of what you're saying. So I would say, look, if you say that sentence in a desert environment where it hasn't rained for a year and rain isn't forecast for a very long time, then understood in that context, it would just be false. And if you're in New York and I'm in Melbourne and rain is forecast for New York and it isn't forecast for Melbourne, then how do we interpret that sentence? Well, if I say that sentence to you, so in order to make sense of that sentence, or at least know what's being said by it, you need to know, what location am I implicitly assuming here? If I'm assuming New York, then it might be true, but if I'm assuming Melbourne, then I might have said something false.
And so, if all parties involved are generally familiar, or as they become more familiar with the content, you can move more and more toward pragmatics and practicality.
Yes, that's right. So the less that you need to be explicit about, the more you can communicate with an economy of words. And that becomes very important for my account. And I should perhaps flag what is philosophically the most controversial and radical part of this idea, which is that, it comes down, one label for it is the question of relativism versus non-relativism or absolutism, whether words like should or good are always relative to some desired outcome. And that is what my theory says, but that's an unpopular and very controversial claim in metaethics and moral philosophy, particularly because of the way in which we use these words morally. So the classic challenge, which comes particularly from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, is that when we use these words morally, we're using them in a categorical way rather than a hypothetical way. And what that means is when we tell someone what they should do in a moral sense, we're not looking, or we don't care about what their goals or desires might be. So, for example, if I tell you, you should take an umbrella today, and you say, why? And I say, well, otherwise you're likely to get wet. And then you say, well, actually, I was planning to spend the whole day in a swim meet. I was planning on getting wet. Then it would be natural for me to say, oh, okay, sorry, I was confused. I take it back. It's not true that you should take an umbrella today. But transpose this to a moral context. Suppose you're driving really, really fast down a crowded street, and I'm sitting next to you, and I say, you should really slow down. And you say to me, well, why should I slow down? And I say, well, if you keep driving like this, you're likely to hit someone and kill them. And then you say to me, yeah, you know what? That would be great. I hate these people. I would love it if I hit one of them and killed them. Now I don't say, oh, okay, sorry, I was mistaken. I take it back. Keep driving. Now I say, well, you really should. That's horrible. You really should slow down. And so philosophers for hundreds of years have said clearly, at least in their moral uses, when we use words like should, we're not just talking about, what's best for some goal that we might want or some outcome that we care about. And so that's I think where the challenges start and where the appeal to pragmatics starts to do work in my theory. And I haven't told you how it does that work, but I think that's important to provide as background to explain, why pragmatics becomes so important in this context. And shall I go on and say how pragmatics helps us out here?
Yeah. We'll take a quick break, Steve. So when we come back, definitely go into that pragmatics and practicality and the latter chapters of the book as well. Thank you. So we're back. Steve, we were talking about your book, Confusion of Tongues, A Theory of Normative Language. And before the break, we were just beginning to talk about pragmatics and practicality. In chapter 5 of the book, you say pragmatics and practicality contains the core of the theory that you're advancing. You say my case for the end relational semantics is that it's a maximally simple and unifying theory that accommodates the truth conditions of a wide variety of ordinary sentences. And so why do you think pragmatics gives us a level of flexibility in this way?
Well, let's see. So I'm not sure that I want to say that pragmatics necessarily gives us flexibility. I think that the semantics, the particular semantic theory I offer, is a very flexible one, and I think it allows these words to be used in a wide variety of ways. And then the job of the pragmatics is to sort of enrich the semantics and allow it to communicate a lot more than it just strictly means.
Yeah.
So just to say quickly, I mean, what do I mean by unifying semantics, which accounts for a whole lot of different uses? I mean, if you just take the word ought or should, for example, there's at least 3 different uses that initially look like they're quite different. So one is the sort of moral use where you tell someone else, you should, do this. A second is the instrumental or hypothetical use where you say, well, if you're going to do this, then you ought to do that. If you want to achieve this, then you ought to do this. And the third one, which really looks different, is just a predictive or probabilistic ought. When you say, for example, it ought to rain today, or the train ought to be here soon. And these looks like a very different meaning than when you tell people what they ought to do.
Right.
But I think with the help of pragmatics, I think you can tell a story on which the word ought or should always has a probabilistic meaning, but that we can just use it for different purposes. We can use it to predict how things will be. We can use it to advise people on how to behave, on how to act. Yeah, so that's an example of how a unifying semantics covering a lot of different uses of a word. And then I haven't explained how the pragmatics helps, but just gestured towards it so far.
Yeah, so from my own understanding, Steve, I can see the second and third usage. If you want to accomplish this, you ought to do that. The train ought to be here soon. Both of those contexts, I can see the use of probability.
Mm-hmm.
But the first instance that you described, sort of a normative statement, you should do something. And oftentimes it is used without really, going back to sort of economics now, a lot of people use those types of statements without any data or analysis or probabilities. So for me, at least, that aspect sort of stands out. Is that not true?
Yes. Yes, so that is the challenge, right? And that's why most philosophers who have thought about this moral should have thought that it needs an entirely different meaning, just an entirely different semantics.
Yeah.
And so part of what I'm doing is trying to explain how, no, actually, you don't need a different meaning. And I mean, one thing I should say is then it becomes a very puzzling or difficult question to say what that moral use of should actually means, which has led some people to appeal to non-natural moral facts, which are somehow there besides the physical world, but are undetectable by any scientific means.
Yeah.
And it's led other philosophers to say, well, that's a whole lot of baloney. There couldn't be any such thing. But nonetheless, clearly that's what we're trying to say. So what that means is that all moral statements must actually be false. And so a fairly popular view in metaethics is known as error theory, which is the claim that actually all moral claims are false because they're like claims about unicorns and unicorns and fairies. There's no unicorns and fairies, and likewise, there's no such thing as moral right and wrong. And so what I try to do is show, I mean, first of all, that we're not just making a big mistake when we saying something fantastical when we use these words this way, but also that we can give a completely explanatory and non-mysterious account of what it is that we are saying. Now, so that's what I try to accomplish. What I haven't done is sort of address your puzzlement about how a unifying story could even be possible.
Yeah.
So shall I give you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So here's the way the story is supposed to go. So what's the role of pragmatics here? If start with the idea that the core meaning of should is a probabilistic one. If you say that something should be the case, then you're saying that probably this will be the case. Now, how do we make sense of then the ordinary instrumental or hypothetical use where I say, well, if you want to stay dry, then you should take an umbrella? And there my answer is, what you're doing is you are conditioning that should on achieving some outcome. So you're saying, if you're going to achieve this outcome, this goal of staying dry, then it's most probable that you take the umbrella, which works out to be roughly equivalent, given some other moves, to saying if taking the umbrella is the option that makes it most likely that you stay dry.
Yeah.
And notice that although that's just a statement on the face of it, that's just a statement about the probabilistic relationship between two events, the event of you taking an umbrella and the event of you staying dry, it has a practical function of giving someone advice and giving them guidance about what to do. Because as long as you care about staying dry, then this is going to be relevant information to you about how to achieve this. Now, so what about the moral case? What if I just say, you shouldn't be driving this fast down the street?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, if there is just a single semantics, then unifying semantics, then there has to be some implied goal or outcome that I am not explicitly stating. And I would say that there is an implicit goal or outcome here. It's that, you know, people, bystanders, pedestrians not get injured. So we can try the interpretation, if you're going to avoid injuring pedestrians, then you should slow down the car, so not drive so fast.
Yeah.
The problem is, we're supposing in this case that you don't care about not hurting the pedestrians. So the challenge is to say, why is it that that's a useful or a relevant thing to say to you in this situation? And the story is, so first of all, I think it's really significant that in these contexts, we don't say, if you want to avoid hurting pedestrians.
Yeah.
And so why would that be if that's part of what we mean? And my suggestion is that the things that we, in general, the things that we don't need to explicitly say are the things that we can expect our conversational partners to already understand and accept. So this goes back to a point you made earlier about, you know, these statements depend upon a huge background of shared information and understanding in order for us to be able to interpret them.
Yeah.
So the thought is usually, I mean, for example, I don't usually have to say to you, if you don't want to get wet, then you should take your umbrella. You'll just understand if I say you should take your umbrella that I have in mind, you know, the possibility of you getting wet. So I don't need to say it in that context. So you're speaking then in a way in which I say you are speaking, well, okay, so I say you're speaking as if, or when I say to you, you should slow down, I am speaking as if there is this shared goal that we have, that we both care about, that pedestrians not be hurt. Now, in this case, we're supposing that it's not true. I'm sorry, I should have taught it the other way around. So I'm the evil, sadistic person, and you're not. So I apologize for putting you in the driver's seat, so to speak.
No worries.
But given that you're there, the thought is, I am speaking as if we both share this concern. In this case, we're supposing this isn't true. But I think I then suggest that this is a recognizable conversational move or rhetorical move that we often use, where we speak as if something were true when it's not, in order to communicate sort of a demand or expectation that it be true. Mm-hmm. So one example is, if you're at the dinner table and your child is talking, spitting food all over the place, and you say, we don't talk with our mouths full at this table. So you've said something which is clearly false. Some of us are talking with our mouths full at the table. But by saying that, you communicate a demand or an expectation that other people you want this to be true and you expect other people to make it true. So if we apply this to the case of you should drive more slowly, I suggest that by speaking that way, I'm communicating my expectation and my demand that you share my concern about the well-being of the pedestrians. And
Yeah.
so that then I think I claim has a prescriptive force in the, if you like, the more pejorative sense of normativity that we started off by talking about. I'm sort of making demands on you by speaking as if we shared this goal, even though we don't. So that's, you might want to redirect and push me on this, but,
Yeah.
but of how it's supposed to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can see sort of the unified idea there, Steve. So I can get used to the idea that when we use the word should, in any context, there is a probabilistic assessment. Now, in the car example, there is a very low probability of something bad happening, but that has extremely costly outcomes if that were to happen. And so, even though the probabilities are lower, the costs are higher. And hence, I use the term should. Now, the complication I see, though, is that if the unified theory is showing that it is really probabilistic, then if the probability assessment, or in some sense, cost assessment, are different for different people. For instance, religion, um, you know, religious leaders could often do often use these terms as if they have some assessment of probability, let's say, but the people they're talking to may not share that, right? So don't we ultimately, even though there is a unified system, aren't we back to sort of pragmatics if those probabilities are quite different?
So one thing to say in response to that is that should claims, on my view, can definitely be false. So if the probabilities that a speaker is pointing towards are not actually the case, then their should statement is simply false, on my view. So if, for example, we have a religious teacher who says, you should go to church every week, I'm going to interpret that as meaning something like, if you want to receive eternal life, then you should go to church every week. Then, in other words, eternal life is more likely if you go to church every week. Now, if we think that the religion is false, and that, then we will think that there is no such raising of the probability of eternal life by going to church every week, then we should simply conclude that what that religious teacher is saying with that should statement is simply false. And that's a implication that I very much like. I want to be able to say that some people's should claims are false.
Right. And so, do you find, we are obviously talking about English.
Yes.
I don't know if you looked at other languages. Do you find this to be significantly different in other languages in any way?
Yes, actually, I'm very pleased you asked that question, because normally, philosophers don't pay a lot of attention to empirical data about cross-linguistic information. I have, because I take the significance of the ordinary uses of language very seriously, as a great clue to what these words mean. I have spent quite a lot of time looking at other languages, and I feel very confident that the data strongly supports this analysis. In fact, it's one of my major arguments for why this analysis is right. So it's a really striking fact. So many philosophers have noted that the word should or ought can be used both in a directive or prescriptive way and also in a predictive way. But most of them have also said that's just homonymy. It's just two different meanings of the same word. It's just an accident. But it turns out that in just about every language that I've ever looked at, the word for should has those two meanings. So I'm particularly pleased to discover this about Mandarin, about Chinese, because it's so completely unrelated a language to English. But in Mandarin, the word yingai is used both for this is what you ought to do, and also this is probably likely to happen. So I'm told by native speakers. So yes, I think the data from other languages is tremendously important, and I have done a little bit of looking to it.
Yeah. And so the Mandarin example, you're saying it's sort of similar to English.
Works, yeah, surprise. So the idea is that if it really was just a case of one word with two completely different meanings, like the word bank in English, financial institution versus sort of the side of a river, riverbank versus financial bank, then you wouldn't expect to find the same pairing in unrelated languages. That would just be an enormous coincidence. So when you find unrelated languages which have the same pairing of uses, that's really good evidence that there's some common core which ties those uses together. And that's supportive evidence for my theory, because my theory says that what ties those uses together is that they're both ultimately about probabilities.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. As you say, Mandarin, a very different language, and if you're finding semantic structures to be very similar between these two languages, then there is something more universal than just the language constructs. Looks like that's what you're finding.
Yes, I've been very encouraged by what. I'm very much an amateur and dabbler when it comes to empirical linguistics, but what I have looked at is I found encouraging.
Yeah. I want to touch on another chapter in the book, categorical and final.
Yes.
You say which has the most important radical application. So what do you mean by categorical and final?
Well, actually, categorical is what we've just been talking about. So this is philosophy speak for the idea that moral oughts don't depend on what we care about, that they are sort of commands from outside of our desires, and you can't escape them just because you don't care about a particular thing. So that part of that chapter I have actually already summarized to you with the whole story about what I might mean when I tell you you shouldn't drive so fast.
Okay.
Now the finality problem, that is a related but different issue, which has to do with what philosophers have called final goods. So there's a very old distinction in philosophy between things being good for the sake of something else versus things being good for their own sakes. And so a common example is, money is good, but money is good because it's good for getting other things. Whereas, pleasure or happiness, for example, they're also good, but they're not good because they're good for other things. If you say, well, what's happiness good for? You might get a quizzical look, and people are, well, that's a strange question to ask, right? Happiness is just good. And so that's what philosophers have referred to as final good, or sometimes intrinsic goodness. And that presents a challenge to my theory because on the face of it, my semantics looks like it's an entirely instrumental semantics where what it is for something to be good is just for it to be good for some outcome. So I have a challenge there to explain what we might mean in saying that happiness is good or pleasure is good. And that, I think, is most people would say is the most radical and crazy part of the book. What I argue is that basically the sense in which pleasure is good is that pleasure is good for itself. The pleasure is good because having pleasure raises the probability of having pleasure. So having pleasure is itself the desired end or outcome that we have in mind when we evaluate pleasure as good. And so that's the very short answer. There's a lot of sort of issues and problems that have to be finessed and navigated to make that sound plausible.
Yeah. Is it the right way to think, Steve, that so we use currency sort of as an intermediate good?
Yes.
But in almost any instance, there is a final outcome.
Yes.
And so the final outcome, in this case, utility, pleasure, whatever it is, happiness, that's foundational. And oftentimes, in a conversational sense, we don't get there, right? We stop a lot before that, and we use something that's countable, measurable, something along those lines, to have that conversation.
Yes. Yes, I think that's right. So if there is then a question for me, given that we usually use words or often use words like good and should without specifying a particular end or outcome that we have in mind, there is a question about, for these ordinary uses, what is the end or outcome that is relevant? And I mean, there my theory is compatible with different answers to that. One answer would be, there is some ultimate end that we always have in mind when we evaluate things. And, maybe it's happiness. So whenever you say something is good, ultimately you mean, well, it's good for happiness. I don't think that's very plausible. I agree entirely with what you said, that usually we're thinking much more short-term and immediate. I mean, for example, the example I've used over and over, you should take an umbrella if you go out today. I think the most natural outcome there is something like, if you want to stay dry. But you can certainly ask the question, well, what's so good about staying dry anyway? And then you can say, well, okay, well, staying dry keeps you in good health and prevents you from getting sick and keeps you comfortable. And, these things are also good. So you can keep asking that question further down the line about what's so good about that outcome. And philosophically, we would hope that, you would come to a final answer. And then that's what the philosopher will say is the final end or the final good. But I agree with you that in ordinary conversation, we're sort of thinking much more in terms of intermediate goals.
Yeah. I mean, this way of thinking is actually quite interesting, Steve. If you think about social media, for example, right? When we use the terms, as we talked about before, terms like should, there is an implicit expectation, and then more often than not, those expectations are highly tactical, right? It's nowhere close to that foundational outcome that you desire. And so, in some sense, this is curtailed thought. I don't know what the right term would be. When you sit in front of a computer engaging in a social media, you essentially have curtailed your thought process to be extremely tactical, and it's almost like a different way of thinking. Do you see that or no?
Yes, I think I don't disagree with anything you said there. So the kind of example which came to mind to me, maybe because you mentioned social media, is sort of political discourse. And
Yeah.
so you've got your Democrats in their Facebook communities, and you've got your Republicans in their Facebook communities, and they're throwing around words like good and ought and right and wrong, and um, there's a whole lot of assumed common ground, right, within those communities where um, we all accept that this is what we want and this is not what we want. And my first instinct would be to understand. I say, for example, in a campaign context, a Republican's use of should might be, assuming a goal like in order to get Republicans elected, whereas a Democrat's use of should could be assuming, in order to get Democrats elected. And then there are, much deeper, more profound questions about, well, why do you really want those things anyway? What's the good of getting a Republican elected? What's the good of getting a Democrat elected? And are these different groups assuming these goals because of some deeper or more fundamental assumption that, having a Republican government is the path to certain goods, like, maybe happiness, or and so there is a question about the very important question, which is tackled in chapter 8 of my book, which I didn't direct you to, about how we should ultimately understand normative disagreements that we have with people about what's good and what we should do. And so at least my semantic theory is compatible both with saying that these disagreements ultimately bottom out in some factual disagreement, sort of scientific disagreement about what courses of action and what choices will ultimately lead to certain goals, where the goals are shared, right? But there's just a disagreement about how to get to them, versus a model in which what really explains these disagreements is that there's just a divergence of goals, and that there's sort of no shared conception of what a good final outcome would be. And so for me, these are two different models of normative disagreement. They're both possible. We can disagree with each other about what should be done because we disagree just about the probabilities. Or we can disagree with each other about what should be done because we just have fundamentally conflicting preferences about the future.
Yes. So are you saying, Steve, that if you take a normative disagreement, if you analyze it deep enough, ultimately you will reach a position that you actually can see why that disagreement happened in more objective, on objective terms. So, in other words, let me make a statement. You can correct me if this is not right. Any normative disagreement, if analyzed to the end, would result in some sort of an objective, objective outcome that would be very clear to both parties.
So, whether I agree with that depends on exactly how we interpret or precisify it. So here's what I would say. I think there are two fundamentally different kinds of normative disagreement. One kind, if we got to the bottom of it, we would find that it's just a disagreement about probabilities. It's a disagreement about the best path to a shared goal. The other kind of disagreement is where if we got to the bottom of it, we would see that we just have different goals. And there's just no shared, there's no consensus on what the ultimate goal should be. Now, I think it's often very hard to tell which of these kinds of disagreements we're engaged in. And political disagreements in the United States, for example, I'm just not sure a lot of the times whether they're ultimately to be explained in terms of different beliefs about probabilities, or just different priorities, different preferences.
The divergent goals, one could think about a situation that the goals ultimately will be the same unless unless you have different objective functions. In other words, going back to your currency, using happiness as a currency, I can't imagine a human being not wanting to be happy, right? And so foundationally, that's the goal. Wouldn't we reach there? Would we find people having completely different goals?
Yes, so that's a very difficult question. It's an empirical psychological question, of course, although a lot of philosophers and religious traditions have ventured opinions about it. And the reason I've been using happiness as an example is that it's the most popular theory historically about what the shared ultimate goal of all human beings might actually be. But it is very controversial. And one thing I would highlight is it is plausible, but even given its plausibility, there is a question about whose happiness is our ultimate goal. So one version of it is to say that each of us, our ultimate concern is our own personal happiness. On that interpretation, psychologically, we are all ultimately selfishly concerned about ourselves and nobody else. Now, and a lot of people have thought that, right? They think, we get along with others, but that's ultimately because it's good for our own happiness. If you think that, then the thing to note is even if there's a sense in which we all have the same goal, which is happiness, that does not actually count as the same goal in my sense, because it's not a common state of the world. I'm aiming at a state of the world in which I'm happy. You're aiming at a state of the world in which you're happy. If those things can be made compatible, then that's good, but they might not be compatible, right? It might be that my happiness comes at the cost of yours, or vice versa. Whereas another version is to say, our ultimate goal is not just our own happiness, but the happiness of everybody. That's what we all ultimately want. And then maybe we would all converge on the same goal. But then you might also think that that's a very optimistic, rosy, Pollyanna-ish view on human nature.
Yeah, it's also a test for, sometimes it's called a level 2 society, right? This idea of convergence of goals, and perhaps that converged goal is parameterized, with very simple set of parameters that everybody agree on. There are ideas around a level 2 society, and this seems like potentially a test for something like that, right? I agree with you. I think our chance of getting to a state like that appears pretty slim.
Right. Yes. So I am not familiar with the level 2 terminology. What I'm maybe most familiar with that comes close is discourse in political philosophy, where the debate about how to construct a liberal democracy where everybody can feel that they consent to the political order and that their interests and values are being respected and taken care of. And one thing to note about that is that that kind of political framework typically assumes that people might have very different individual ultimate goals, but that in the political sphere, we can come to agree on some principles or institutions which serve each of us maybe in different ways, but to everybody's advantage. So
yeah.
if that's the picture, then it is compatible with us. It is, the hope is that it's compatible with us not converging in our ultimate goals, but that at least we can agree on some principles for society.
Right. Yeah. So, Steve, in conclusion, what would you say the most important idea in the book?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. I think there are a lot of important ideas. I guess I will say that I think the most important idea, because it goes to the most fundamental philosophical question that the book addresses, is that ultimately value and norm and morality are things which answer to us and our needs and our desires rather than the other way around. So what we want comes first, and what's good and bad and right and wrong is just a reflection or shadow of that. Because many philosophers think that the reverse is true, and that what's good and bad, right and wrong comes first, and our desires and preferences need to adapt themselves to that independent reality. So that's the most important idea, I think. Although it's also not a particularly unique idea, because many of my fellow philosophers are also arguing for the same view in their own ways.
Right. Excellent, Steve. Thanks so much for spending
It's been
time
a real
with me.
pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.